Sargon's talk that was interrupted ended up going ahead anyway and is available on YouTube, but it's over an hour long, and it's not really a talk, it's an interview with the head of the Ayn Rand Institute, which gives me a wonderful opportunity to object to objectivism. There's only one problem with that, in that Randroids are perhaps only second to pedophiles in their tendency to bombard the comments on any video that's even slightly critical of objectivism, which is anything but objective. But we'll see how it goes. So it's not going to be a direct response, but I will be talking about some of the points that were brought up in the discussion. So what is objectivism? Well, it's the cod philosophy of Ayn Rand, who in fleeing the Soviet Union appears to have gone completely the other direction into completely radical individualism. Some of the basic ideas of objectivism are pretty sound, that reality exists independent of consciousness, that our senses give us a window into this objective world, and that facts and so on can and do exist. So in that way it's kind of a antidote to postmodernism in a lot of ways, which is pretty good. But in practice it turns into a kind of legitimization of selfishness. Now, LaVeyan Satanism has been described as spiritual libertarianism, and objectivism is kind of philosophical libertarianism, and it does provide these excuses for selfish and non-altruistic behaviour. And all of this is vested in what they call rational self-interest. We'll get to that in a second. So it's a kind of radical individualism at the opposite end of radical collectivism, I suppose is how you could characterize it. Now, Haidt has described humanity as being 90% chimp and 10% bee. I'm not quite sure he has the right of it there, because chimps are already on their way to being bees. Chimps form into troops, extended kin groups. They have culture because tool use and the knowledge of certain locations is passed down through education in chimps. They operate collectively, they're altruistic, they punish unfairness. You know, they're not really that different to us, except on the basis of scale and mental capacity. Whereas bees are colonial, the term is eusocial, and sacrifice everything for the good of the hive, the same with ants and so on. I would say humans are perhaps 10% bee, 80% chimp, and the other 10% some kind of solitary, purely individualistic animal, like, say, a male tiger or a female praying mantis or something. So we have this tension between the communal and the individual, and most of the time we're in a kind of semi-happy middle ground, which is where humanity tends to operate best. Our evolutionary past is much like that of the chimp. We were organised into families, kinship groups, tribes, troops, eventually building all the way up into nations and peoples on whatever arbitrary grounds we decided to organise ourselves on. Cooperation is hardwired into humanity. Altruism is hardwired into humanity, because when we aid each other, we all benefit. A group working together has a far greater survival chance than an individual on their own. In most circumstances, there can be advantage to cheating, but we tend to punish cheating as a group. When we see unfairness, when we see someone cheat, when we see someone steal or lie, they're breaking that social contract between individuals that aids the group in total survival. A pride of lions is more effective than an outcast male lion hunting on his own. A troop of chimps can harvest an area more quickly or bring down monkeys to eat, which is something that does happen. Yeah, and in the extreme example, colonial organisms, eusocial organisms like ants, like bees, everything is sacrificed for the good of the hive, and the hive survives because of that sacrifice. This is hardwired into us on a base genetic level. It is who and what we are. It accounts for most of the success of humanity as a species, particularly since this mutual care, this altruism, this group activity allows us to raise our mostly helpless young, which is fairly uncommon in the animal kingdom apart from in humans. So you have to keep this in mind moving forward. Biologically, psychologically, this is who we are. Groups, altruists. Objectivism posits a thing called rational self-interest, as opposed to enlightened self-interest, which is the term and the spin on the phenomenon that I prefer. In Objectivism, this rational self-interest is very much focused on the self part. When we do things to help others, we're doing it because it's in our own interests, and that's our motivating force. In enlightened self-interest, it's more the other way around. We aid others because we are compelled to, because it is instinctual, because of empathy and understanding of the position it's in to be another person, and because we want to live in a society where we were down on our luck, people would help us. So there is still self-interest, but the motivation is more selfless. And we all benefit from a society in which people help each other out. And again, this has been selected for throughout human history, as far back as you can say that there were humans of any type, hominids of any type, even apes of any type, you could say this. So this is a really strong and powerful force, but where Objectivism puts this selfish spin on it, I personally prefer and interpret enlightened self-interest. When you help people, even when it's not obvious that there's any immediate benefit to yourself, there is. So it's in our interest to help others anyway. One of the biggest flaws and mistakes in Objectivism, I think, is the discounting of human emotion. Now, they might talk about doing things that encourage human flourishing and things which make you happy, but if you delve into the philosophy, it tends to ignore and sideline human emotion. So this is a very hardline utilitarian perspective. But I think even that's missing something. I think even a utilitarian can point to emotional needs being satisfied as being a good thing, something that serves the general interest, something that is utilitarian. Though more strictly this would be called Epicureanism, the pursuit of pleasure. But I think you're going too far that way doesn't work either. So I think we need some kind of synthesis here. Do you think people can flourish without being happy? I don't think so. And I think that what makes us happy is not necessarily always the purely rational thing. We can sacrifice a certain amount of rationality for irrationality, but we get pleasure out of it, which increases our quality of life, which makes it rational to pursue it. I mean, let's take one example. We all have a biological urge to reproduce, most of us, almost all of us. If I fulfill that urge by going to a sperm bank and making a deposit, I have passed on my genes, I have reproduced, but is that satisfying in the same way that having and raising a child would be? No. Yeah, it's rational. You have exercised that urge, that purpose, that biological remit that we all have. But you don't get the emotional satisfaction, the payoff, the connection to another human being, to seeing them grow, to making another human being. So there's an element of happiness and satisfaction that has utilitarian knock-on effects that comes from things which aren't on the surface rational, because these are hardwired biological, evolutionarily psychological impetuses that we do have. And we can see the negative utilitarian consequences of not meeting those needs in other societies. China's one-child policy has led to a huge disparity in the genders, with far more men than women, and this is a big worry, because when this imbalance tends to happen, and men cannot have fulfilled lives, cannot find girlfriends or wives, society tends to get into trouble. Crime rises, violence rises, as competition rises. It generally makes things rather unstable, and this seems to be part of what China is responding to in more recent policy changes. So we can see that there's a practical destabilizing societal effect that harms everyone if we don't meet people's emotional needs. Or we also see that in other countries where a lack of social investment in certain areas, or long-term unemployment, the inability to be fulfilled in some way, causes breakdown, causes crime, causes substance abuse, because people are rationally seeking ways in drugs or drink or whatever else in order to compensate for the lack of meaning and pleasure in their life. So that's a way of fulfilling that need. It can be a rational, even a long-term rational approach to these problems. And the ultimate irony of objectivism is that it cannot escape altruism. Objectivism sells itself on the idea that this kind of radical individualism is good for everybody, and that is an altruistic impetus. It further falls down if we consider how things would turn out if we all individually acted in our own self-interest, our rational self-interest. It does me good, and it does millions of other people good, to be in a society where you are taxed, everyone is taxed, and we do things collectively because it works out cheaper that way. You get the economy of scale, and people who otherwise couldn't afford to get assistance get assistance. So just sheerly by applying that rational self-interest, you end up with pretty much what we have today, which is competing interests. Really powerful individuals trying to shift laws and society in one way, and the mass of people as a block trying to shift things the other. So all you end up with is pretty much exactly what we have, with people operating in their own self-interest, and politics and society being a tug of war between these two poles. So the whole exercise is basically pointless. Zang.